and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Cheerfulness Breaks In by Angela Thurkill. Geraldine ran up the steps to the nurse's entrance and was engulfed by the hospital. Philip came back and took his seat beside Captain Fairweather, who drove back at excessive speed, singing a cheerful song and vouchsafing no explanation to Philip, who did not need any. When they got to the Carter's house, Captain Fairweather told Philip that he was going over to the Burkitts for a few moments and vanished into the darkness. The Burkitts were surprised by the return of Geraldine's escort and at once jumped to the conclusion that there had been an accident and Geraldine was dead, and Captain Fairweather had come, singularly calm and unscathed, to tell them so. "Sorry to barge in, sir," said Captain Fairweather, "but I thought you'd like to know I landed Geraldine at the hospital all right. She's got my address, and if she wants me, I'll manage to get over at almost any time." "That's very good of you, Jeff," said Mrs. Burkitt, wondering. "Being almost one of the family, with John and Rose married," said Captain Fairweather, "I don't think it would be a bad plan if Geraldine and I got married. I just thought I'd break it to you." As his future parents-in-law appeared to be struck all of a heap, he continued, standing over them with a pleasant impression of self-reliance and kindness. "She needs someone to look after her. That little blighter Gissing won't bother her again. I'm not as well off as John because Aunt Emma didn't leave me anything, but I'll have a bit when Uncle Henry dies, and the doctors have been saying for 4 years that it wouldn't be long. So if you don't want to turn me down, we might take that as settled." The Burkitts were so taken aback by this totally unexpected development that they were bereft of speech, until Mrs. Burkitt recovered herself enough to ask weakly if Geraldine knew. "She knows all right," said Captain Fairweather. "I gave her the idea, and it'll soak in all right. She can get married whenever she likes. I should say before I get sent abroad would be better than after, because one never knows if one will come back." By this time, his shock tactics had reduced Mr. and Mrs. Burkitt to such a state of imbecility that they would have agreed equally to marriage by special license on the following morning, or an engagement lasting 10 years. When they compared notes afterward, they found that nothing better than tags from Victorian novels had floated into their minds. Mr. Burkitt having with difficulty subdued his inclination to say, "Bless you, my boy, and may she make you happy," and Mrs. Burkitt having an almost irresistible impulse to say that she felt she was not losing a daughter but gaining a son. Both were a little ashamed to discover that cliché can be the best expression of emotion, and both secretly regretted that they had not had the fun of giving vent to it. Mrs. Burkitt was the first to pull herself together. "It seems so sudden, Jeff," she said, reflecting even as the words left her mouth that it was rather the affianced than the affianced mother who ought to use these time-consecrated words. "But I'm sure Geraldine will be very happy with you, and I can really think of nothing nicer." "Well, it surprised me as much as it surprised you," said Captain Fairweather with great candor. "But when I saw that little swine frightening Geraldine, I thought the Barsetshires ought to do something about it. Anyway, I've known her since I was a kid, and she was a pretty ghastly kid herself," said the gallant captain meditatively. "So we ought to make a do of it. John will be pleased. He likes Geraldine." "Oh," said Mrs. Burkitt, determined to offer all she had to give, "there is something in Rose's letter that you'd like to hear, Jeff, but I didn't read it aloud. Wait a minute." She went to her writing table, found Rose's letter, and handed it to Captain Fairweather, pointing to the last paragraph. Captain Fairweather read the following words. "P.S. I don't remember if I said in my last letter, but I'm going to have a baby in August. It seemed a bit dispiriting at first, but now I think it's absolutely marvelous, and he is to be William after Daddy, and Jeffrey after Jeff, or if it's twins, Amy after you, and Kate because of Kate. The doctor, which is Juan Robinson's father, said I was to be sensible but have a good time. Isn't it marvelous? With heaps of love from Rose." Captain Fairweather grinned from ear to ear and handed the letter back to Mrs. Burkitt. "Jolly good," he remarked. "I didn't quite get it all the first time, but I see what she means. We'll call ours Rose, or if he's a boy, John. Well, I must be getting along. Thanks most awfully for the Christmas treat and dinner and everything, Mrs. Burkitt. Good night, sir." He departed, leaving the Burkitts shattered, but on the whole content. Though neither of them would have said it for worlds, the prospect of their younger daughter being married filled them with a sense of relief, only comparable to that which they had felt when Rose was safely off their hands. They were good parents, and would rather have gone on putting up with Geraldine than see her married to the Gissing of her choice, though they knew that if she had wanted it, they were powerless to prevent her. But to think of her in the reliable keeping of Fairweather Senior, who, though one should not think of such things, they are of the utmost importance, would not be badly off, was as good as having a hot bath and a large tea after a long walk in the rain. As for the possibilities, the probabilities, of some quick tragedy cutting across Jeff and Geraldine's life, on these it was worse than useless to brood, and from them they resolutely turned their minds. On his return to Mrs. Carter's house, Captain Fairweather found his host and hostess and Philip Winter very comfortably in the study with a large fire and pipes and drinks. From what Philip had told them, the Carters were not unprepared for Captain Fairweather's news, but they managed to receive it as a complete surprise and with far more outward manifestation of joy than the Burketts had shown. When Kate went to bed, the two soldiers fell into army talk, of which Everard took advantage to finish the house reports. At 11:45, he had signed the last, and when he had put them into their envelopes, he got up and stretched himself. "I am sorry, Everard," said Philip, conscience-stricken. "I'd forgotten you were alive." "But I am," said Everard, sitting down in a large chair by the fire. "It was pleasantly like the old days to hear you talking, Philip." "I don't know," said Philip, whose conscience appeared to be rearing its head in more directions than one. "I don't know why you didn't kick me out of the house, Everard. I haven't a great opinion of myself now, but when I think of what a frightful, blethering communist nuisance I was, with every antenna, if that word has a singular, out to find a fence and take it, I feel I ought to be condemned to live in the London School of Economics for the rest of my life." "You weren't too bad," said Everard. "Do you remember when you accused Swan of looking at you through his spectacles?" "That boy had a devilish and subtle mind," said Philip. "I still believe that he forced his mother to buy those spectacles so he could look at me through them. Where is he?" "Cambridge," said Everard, "my old college. He gets called up next month." "I think, sir," said Captain Fairweather, "it's almost rottener for schoolmasters than anyone. I mean, all these youngsters getting called up." "That's nice of you, Jeff," said Everard. "It takes the heart out of one sometimes. But it isn't one's own body that is going to be blown up or drowned, and one has no right to be to such damned sensibility about such things. It doesn't help. One can't help envying Swan and all the others. If only there were something to do. Anything but schoolmastering, keeping safe." Philip, in all his experience of Everard, had never heard him speak with such impatience, and realized, with the sensitiveness that had formerly made him such a nuisance to himself and his colleagues, how much Everard and thousands of men of his age, in his position, might be suffering. But he found nothing to say. Captain Fairweather, with the patience that the good professional fighter has for the civilians, said, "It's rotten for you, sir. That's where fellows who aren't brainy, like John and me, are so lucky. I expect you brood a lot. I've noticed that pretty well everyone wants to be doing something different. If you don't mind my saying so, sir, I think it's a jolly good job. I mean, looking after all these kids. Lots of our fellows have got brothers or nephews or cousins here, and they're all glad to think of the kids having a good time. That's thanks to you and old Pa Berkey and the rest, sir. I admit we get most of the fun, but that's our job. And we don't have all your troubles with rationing and evacuees. I can tell you one sometimes feels a bit ashamed with nothing to worry about and all you people sweating away teaching and running games and the exams. It's really a frightfully decent show, sir." He was then afraid he had talked too much, shook hands violently, and went off to bed, where he fell asleep at once, and to Kate's intense pleasure did not come down to breakfast till after 10 o'clock. Everard and Philip alone looked at each other. "That's a good boy," said Philip. "Geraldine's in luck. He sees straight, which is more than the brainy ones, as he calls them, can always do. I suppose I'm a bit of a giddy hermaphrodite myself, soldier and schoolmaster at once. You know, Everard, you're an extraordinarily good fellow yourself, though severely handicapped by brains." "To think I should live to hear my junior housemaster talk to me like that," said Everard. "Sign of the times. You go up, I'll put out the lights." Chapter 13. Brief Winter Interlude. 2 days after Christmas, it began to snow in Barsetshire. By the end of the next week, the whole county was one vast skating rink on which men, women, horses, motors, lorries, and bicycles slipped and slithered and swore. The hosiers' boys, who had never seen a country winter before, went about with grateful hearts for benefits conferred. The river rose and flooded the cricket ground a foot deep, so that the hosiers' boys had the supreme bliss of rowing on it on a Friday and skating on it on a Saturday. Mr. Burkett had holes punched in an old boiler and turned it into a brazier, which the hosiers' boys kept supplied with wood from Thumble Coppice. Skaters, who came in dozens from the neighborhood, warmed their hands and feet at its glow and gratefully drank hot soup, which Mrs. Burkett and Mrs. Moreland brought down in fish kettles and heated. Mrs. Phelps suddenly showed herself a first-class skater, and, for once justifying her trousers and lumber jacket, performed the most dazzling evolutions with Everard Carter. Kate brought Bobby down in his perambulator, and as he slept the whole time, he was considered to have enjoyed himself very much and shown great intelligence. All the evacuees slid in one corner, threw snowballs at each other with uncertain aim, got wet through twice a day, were smacked, dried, and put to bed by their foster mothers, and returned next day as full of zeal as ever. Manners, the nicest of the hosiers' boys, made with the assistance of Edward the Odd Man a wooden sledge upon which he gave rides to children below school age. At Everard Carter's house, the bathroom cistern froze and a pipe burst, reminding Matron of the time that Hackett left the hot tap running and nearly flooded the lower dormitory. The Burketts' supply of coal and coke was held up by the state of the roads, and for 3 days there was no central heating, which made Mr. Burkett go to London and spend 2 nights at his club, where he had some incredibly dull conversations with the older members, who were all waiting to pounce on any fresh face and tell it their valueless views on things in general. Adelina and Maria Cottage spent all their evenings together at Maria, partly to save fuel, and partly because Mrs. Bissell could not go out at night, as Mrs. Dingle couldn't stay and keep an eye on little Edna, with the roads in that state. At the Barchester Hospital, such a crop of road accidents came in that the German measlers were despised by the nurses, nearly all of whom had chilblains, and Geraldine was so cheered by compound fractures that she almost forgot the mortification she had received at young Mr. Gissing's hands, and wrote long letters to Captain Fairweather about the horribleness of Matron, who had put the most attractively maimed patients into the D ward. The water main in the close burst, and the bishop's cellar was flooded, which had last occurred in 1936, and gave intense joy to nearly all the inferior clergy, Mr. Miller at Pomfret Madrigal going so far as to refer to it in conversation with Mrs. Brandon as a crowning mercy. Ribald humor had it that the bishop's second-best gaiters had been washed onto the front doorsteps of Canon Thorne, a peaceful elderly bachelor with high church leanings, whom the bishop had accused of being a Mariolater and having no soul. But it was universally recognized that this was too good to be true. In the middle of all this, Noel Merton came down for a night to the deanery and rang up Lydia Keith, which was just as well, for the next day 2 miles of telephone wires came down, and Sir Edmund Pridham said any fool would have known they would never stand the strain between Grumpers End and Tidcombe Halt, and wrote a long letter to the Barchester Chronicle, which they printed with a number of cuts that made nonsense of it. "I'd love to see you, Noel, but I'm most frightfully busy," said Lydia's voice on the telephone. "Wait a minute. I've got to go and see about some pig food, and there's a Red Cross thing here, and it's the day I do the communal kitchen. Look here, could you possibly come here directly after lunch about 2 o'clock? I could fit you in then. If you want a bath, our hot water's all right." Noel thanked her and said the deanery water was luckily all right so far, and he would come at 2 o'clock unless the chains fell off his car or the road at Tidcombe Halt was flooded. When Lydia had rung off, he felt for a moment unreasonably depressed. It was not like Lydia to say she would try to fit him in. Then he gave himself a mental shake and reminded himself that Lydia was a very busy person, and that so far she had done very much more useful work than he had. He returned to the library and was writing some letters when the dean's secretary came in. "Oh, good morning," said Mr. Needham with a well-simulated start of surprise. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not a bit," said Noel. "If anyone is doing any disturbing, I am, writing my letters here." "I expect you are frightfully busy," said Mr. Needham. "One is not a distinguished barrister for nothing, and Noel's ear at once detected the voice of someone who wanted to talk, probably about himself. So he licked up an envelope, put his fountain pen in his pocket, and said he had just finished. "Come and keep me company," said Noel. "How is everyone? I got here late last night and came down disgracefully late to breakfast, and I've hardly had a word with Mrs. Crawley." Mr. Needham said the dean was very well and very busy and very well, he added, with an earnestness which he hoped might cover the idiocy of his reply. "And how is Octavia?" asked Noel Merton. "Still at the hospital?" Mr. Needham's ingenuous face assumed a reverent expression. "Octavia is quite magnificent," he said. "She simply lives for the hospital. Even when she is at home, she talks about nothing else. It makes me feel so useless." "Oh, come, come," said Noel. "Think how much the dean needs your help." "Anyone could do a secretary job," said Mr. Needham dejectedly. "I'm frightfully fit and strong, and it seems such a waste to be writing letters when all my football friends are doing their bit. There are heaps of people with flat feet or something who could do my job, or even women. I mean, it's a great privilege to be working for the dean, but it's pretty awful, especially when I think of Octavia." "I suppose you won't believe me," said Noel, "but I often feel exactly like that myself." Mr. Needham stared. "But you're a soldier, an officer," he said. "As a matter of fact, I'm a secretary like you," said Noel, "secretary in uniform. I have hopes of being blown to bits or rotting in an enemy dungeon some day, but for the moment I chiefly fill up forms and do odd jobs of interviewing people. And if it is any comfort to you, when I look at Lydia Keith and see how much she is doing, I think it's pretty awful myself." Mr. Needham almost gaped. That Mr. Merton, that ex-man of the world, now practically a death's head hussar, or at least a secret agent of high degree, should feel as out of things as a dean's secretary was extremely upsetting to all his ideas, and yet comforting. "The fact is," said Noel, partly to reassure Mr. Needham, partly following his own thoughts, "everyone wants to be doing something different since the war began, except the people who are actually in the thick of it. I don't suppose either of us are particularly afraid of the idea of danger or discomfort, but we feel we are wasting our time. As a matter of fact, I don't believe we are. Lydia and Octavia make one feel rather ashamed," said Noel, basely pandering to Mr. Needham by throwing in Octavia, of whom he had no very great opinion, though in quite a friendly way. "But they have had the luck to find their jobs made to their hand, and the great self-control to stick to them. I know Lydia is pining to nurse, but her mother needs her, and so does the estate and all the local things. Octavia wanted to nurse, didn't she?" This slight denigration of Octavia could not pass without a protest. "She loves her work, especially head wounds," said Mr. Needham, "but she did once tell me, when we were talking about things, that she thought it would be splendid to train as a medical missionary," said Mr. Needham. Noel nearly said he would be sorry for the savages, but restraining himself, said it was a very fine ambition. Mr. Needham said a missionary's life was, of course, in many ways the highest calling one could imagine, but of course, if one could possibly be a chaplain at the front— He stopped, diffident at having betrayed a secret, mumbled something about meeting a train, and went away, leaving Noel to finish his letters with a divided mind. After an odious drive along the by-roads, with a fall of snow the day before and a fresh attack of freezing, so that they were one long pitfall, Noel got to Northbridge Manor, where he found Lydia angrily strewing sand on the front doorsteps. "Hello," said Lydia. "Our idiot kitchen maid washed the steps with hot water this morning to melt the ice, and Father nearly broke his leg when he went out to get the car. Come round onto the terrace and help me carry some things indoors. I'll have to take these 2 bay trees in tubs into the hall, or we'll lose them. I did put straw around them, but it won't be enough." Noel accompanied her to the terrace, where, though the air was cold, there was shelter from the wind, and a pale sunlight gave a faint illusion of warmth. He and Lydia were able to lift the 2 trees and carry them through the garden door into the hall, where they looked very well, though lumpy. "I'll take the straw off afterwards," said Lydia, surveying their trussed shapes. "Come outside for a moment. I feel so stuffy after that communal kitchen." "Was it rabbit stew?" asked Noel, falling into step with her on the stone flags, where the frozen snow had been partly scraped away. "Shin of beef and dumplings and tapioca pudding," said Lydia, "and we had to bring all the water in pails because the pump froze. I'm pleased to see you, Noel." "So am I," said Noel, which Lydia quite understood. Lydia then put Noel through a searching examination about his physical welfare and the general state of things at the deanery. It did not pass unnoticed by Noel that she never asked about his work. He was able to report that he felt disgustingly well and the food in the mess was good. He then gave her a fairly faithful narration of his conversation with Mr. Needham. "He and Octavia don't seem to get down to it," said Lydia, with a touch of her old intolerance for any methods but the most direct and bludgeoning. "I must speak to Tommy. He's really a bit too stupid for Octavia, but she is pretty stupid too. I think they ought to get engaged, and then Tommy ought to be a military chaplain, and they could get married after the war. Octavia won't want to stop being a nurse, but if Matron gets any more horrible, she might go to France, and then if Tommy were there, she might see him sometimes." Having thus disposed of her young friends, she stopped, and they took another turn. "You don't think I ought to be nursing, do you, Noel?" she asked, with what for Lydia was almost diffidence. "No," said Noel. "You are a good girl, a very good girl, and you are doing everything you ought to do." Lydia returned on him a look of such gratitude that he was abashed to receive so much for so little. They continued to pace the terrace in silence very comfortably. "I wish Mother would get better," said Lydia, with such a forlorn note that Noel's heart was wrenched. "So do I," he said. "And if you need me, you will let me know, won't you? I could probably manage to get over at any time you needed a bit of comforting." "I'd like that more than anything in the world," said Lydia, "but I wouldn't ever, ever ask you however much I wanted it. Thank you most awfully, though." She slipped her hand into Noel's as they walked. He, surprised and touched by her mute appeal, so unlike the Lydia he knew, gave her hand the slightest pressure and then let it lie in his, anxious not to presume in any way upon her confidence. If a kind but ferocious hawk had suddenly perched on his hand in a friendly way, he could not have been more surprised. Glancing at her profile as she walked beside him in the pale afternoon sunshine, he noticed a faint shadow under her cheekbones that again strangely wrung his heart. It occurred to him that ever since he had known her, Lydia had been shouldering other people's burdens. Sometimes, it is true, in a very rambunctious and almost interfering way, but always with the best of intentions. And of late, in a quieter, more self-effacing way, she had taken responsibility more and more upon her, till her father, her mother, the house, the little estate, and much of the local war work seemed to depend very largely upon her. Noel thought of his own life among men of his own sort, doing work that was more interesting than he was allowed to say, full of food for his mind, with no particular troubles except such as the world in general had to share. There was his Lydia, doing work beyond her years, often alone, tied by an ailing mother, the long evenings spent with parents whose life and interests, much as they loved her and she them, were far away from hers. It seemed to him that his Lydia needed a friend. Not needed, perhaps, for she seemed to be unconscious of having that anything was wanting, but a friend she ought to have, someone older than herself who could give her help and support, someone not so much older that he could not see things as she saw them with her younger eyes. What Lydia needed, in fact, he decided, was someone rather like himself, very fond of her, loving her for her very faults, her brusqueness, her occasional overbearing ways, loving her too for her courage, her newly learnt patience, her capable ways, and above all for the rare moments when she let herself bend a little under her burdens. Such a moment was upon her now, and Noel cherished it. Deep peace lay on the downs, the water meadows, and the manor, a white, unfamiliar landscape, quiet as midnight, untouched by the world's troubles. And we'll follow Lydia and Noel further next time.